the more we understand about the minds of other animals, the more we appreciate how arbitrary the lines that we draw between them. And I mean, not just the scientific lines, but the ethical lines. So, one of the things that I hope Meet the Neighbors does is really provide a framework for understanding kind of how those lines came to be drawn in the first place and kind of what is this like intellectual infrastructure we inherit in how we think about animals.
Welcome to the Sentient podcast. My name is Anna Bradley. I'm the executive director at Sentient, and this is our first interview since our rebrand earlier this year, and our first conversation where we have our editor-in-chief, Jenny Splitter, who's going to co-host with me today. And I am deeply excited about this conversation because, as those of you who have listened to this podcast before, the reason I set this up was to talk to people who are really changing the way that we think about and interact with the world around us and the inhabitants that we share the planet with. So, who better to speak to than Brandon Keim? Brandon is an independent journalist who specializes in science, nature, and animals. And we're here to talk about his book, his latest book, Meet the Neighbors, which follows on from his first book, The Eye of the Sandpiper, which I also absolutely adored. And Brandon's work, aside from these books, has appeared in the New York Times, in the Atlantic, in Wired, Nautilus. And yeah, I want to get started with you, Brandon. Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored, both of you.
Okay, so I just want to kick things off by addressing the title of this new book. I find it so clever and also confronting in a way. We at Sentient think a lot about the language that people use to describe animals. And you talk in your book about these animals that many people would consider pests, like rats and even coyotes. And you're taking that language of like pests and stuff and turning it into this idea of actually, these are our neighbors. And you go on this really tangible journey that you can just feel like you're walking there with you through your neighborhood, telling the stories, of each of these animals in a way that is framed in science, but also kind of personhood of these animals. I'm just so curious, what motivated you to create that kind of framing and tell the story in this way?
Yeah, I'm really glad that resonated with you because that section. So that's sort of the first section of the book is that, walk through an everyday Eastern American suburban neighborhood and, and looking at the non-human residents of that neighborhood and kind of mapping the science of animal intelligence onto them. And so back when I first thought that I might write a book and Meet the Neighbors was still a glimmer in my eye. It was really going to be much more of a straightforward science of animal intelligence book because that's where I was coming to the subject material from was as a daily science journalist. And so over time it became much more of a so here's the science. And so what are we going to do with this book? But still that first section is kind of, a distillation of the book that I would have written. And, what I was really trying to get at there's sort of two things. So one of them is that, we live at this amazing moment for the scientific study of animal intelligence, right? It's like every day there is some interesting new finding, and it's kind of really gone from, even just a few years ago, there was a sense that oh, okay, well, chimpanzees and whales and elephants and and crows and ravens, of course, there's this sort of handful of extra smart species, but that's kind of where the animal intelligence discourse was. And now it's just no, right? There's these rich forms of intelligence all over the place. I mean, in a great many species. And so I wanted to really capture that and also capture, make those insights feel more approachable and organic. And, I think sometimes I find with myself, I'll read a news story about a find an animal intelligence finding, and it can still feel very abstracted, right? Like so much of it is about like the methodology of the study, and this is taking place in an experiment, and there's still kind of that, veil between you and the animals. It's almost like the story is about the animals, and yet in a weird way, the animals themselves aren't fully present. So I just wanted to make, those findings and that appreciation of the minds of other animals really come more alive than it does in kind of unusual, and this study says, and this study says, and so on. And then there's also just a sensibility, which is really something that, that grew for me when I was living in the suburban Eastern neighborhood, where that first section takes place, where and I talk about this early in the book, where there was this little stream that I used to like to go and sit beside every morning. It was like it was a stormwater drainage stream that went into a big stormwater retention pond, but it was still a very natureful and lifeful place. And so I used to love just, really at the beginning of every day and the end of every day, I would just go and sit by the stream and gather my thoughts, and maybe I would do work and whatever. Um, and in the same place every day, I was seeing the same animals that, and especially birds. There were a great many birds who came and would bathe in the stream, catbirds and mockingbirds and sparrows and starlings and, the whole community. And it was really with them that it sunk in for them, that it sunk in with me, that like these creatures, like this is just where they lived, right? This is their morning routine. It was just like seeing somebody at the coffee shop or the gym, and like it really made me appreciate that I was living in a community, of that was full of both people and animals. And then later on, I do try to take that sensibility really out into the world. So it's not just about the animals who live around us, although I think they're enormously important. But really that attitude is something that can encompass all animals. And I should say also not just wild animals. And maybe this is something we can get into later in the conversation, and kind of how to, where one draws the line as an author you know, in sort of who I'm writing about, and trying to write about animals in a very in a very animal forward way, um, that walks the line between not saying to people, well, you better be vegan if you're thinking this way, because if not, but at the same time also not sort of reinscribing the lines that we do draw between animals, all of whom should be thought of as fellow persons. I don't know if that last bit made any sense, but hopefully so.
I think that's like everything we wanted to ask you about. It's it all up very nicely, because this is kind of the things I was mentioning when Anne and I were prepping for this. And I think I also messaged you, along those same lines. Like, I think that was highly effective at making the whole topic feel very accessible, because I feel like I'm not someone who, there's people who just like read and devour every book about wildlife, and I'm not really one of those people. And so I felt very much like, oh, but also wildlife's, happening all around me. Like, I felt like I was immediately kind of drawn in, which was really great. So I love that you mentioned this kind of like moment of the science of animal sentience, because that's also what I wanted to ask you about. Because so when I joined Sentient, I hadn't really covered any of that sort of area as a freelancer, as a science journalist myself. And so I felt like, gosh, there's like a million things going on all the time in this field. And I guess what I wanted to ask you is like, was there some inflection point recently you felt like where all of a sudden everything sort of unlocked? Or was it, because you do kind of start with sort of, you bring us back to Darwin and kind of start about talk about some of the origins. But yeah, I guess just having not really, covered the field myself, is it sort of like, things are going along kind of at this pace, and then all of a sudden something kind of blows everything wide open? Or was it my imagination that everything, was exploding recently? Sounds like no. Also, there's a lot going on right now. But yeah, I'm just wondering, as someone who like covers this more closely, how you look at like the field and inflection points, I guess.
There's probably there's probably some enterprising postdoc out there who's like done the literature search and has the graph that they could show us. But like, I definitely feel like we've hit some sort of inflection point. I'm gonna say maybe like the last 5 years or so have really felt like this for me. Like I think like like the mid to late 2000s are, for me at least, when things, the pot really started boiling, or at least bubbling. And then, it just kept on getting, there was just more and more activity throughout the 2010s and sort of, finally getting to the point where we are now. And so there's actually maybe a couple of good signposts for thinking about this. So I think it was back in 2012, there was the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, where a group of scientists said that, if I remember correctly, that there was ample evidence to say that mammals, and I think it was mammals and birds, or at least like mammals and many birds, or mammals and probably birds, could be considered conscious, and that this should be an uncontroversial statement. And then very recently, there was sort of an update to that, where it was an official statement from an even larger group of scientists saying that sufficient evidence existed to consider pretty much all vertebrates and a great many invertebrates conscious as well. And I think, and so like their announcement wasn't just like some new study was done yesterday that shows that all animals are conscious. It was, the culmination of findings that have been accumulating across this time. So I think, we really have had this tremendous efflorescence of these insights in the last, 5 years or so. And it's also, I think, really bubbled out much more in popular culture. And one hears so much less frequently these days, the charge that you're being anthropomorphic if you if you see other animals as thinking, feeling beings. And I think there've been enough books now about the science of animal intelligence that these ideas are kind of, just sort of much more ingrained in the general consciousness. And I think where things are getting interesting, and sort of where there's still, where there's still a lot of I'm not going to say uncertainty is the wrong word, but basically, so we've got the science, and now we're all just trying to figure out, all right, like what are the implications of all of these insights for the relationships that we have with animals, whether it's animals who are used in food or research or companions, or wild animals, like in my book.
This might be a little bit like outside of where we're going, but like thinking about the science and thinking about how it's altering how we're perceiving animals, I feel like there's this line between like curiosity, like presuming curiosity or choice of action in animals. And like full disclosure, I spent like a month in Cape Cod earlier this year, and I last night watched Jaws because I felt like I have to like pay homage to my Cape Cod time. I was too scared to go in the water. And watching Jaws last night, I was like, it is so interesting, and how much has changed in our perception of animals, but also how little, because, as Brandon, I spoke to you about this briefly last year as well, the orca, the alleged orca attacks that we're seeing on boats, they've resurfaced again this year, and there's more media coverage about this, the orca conspiracy of, trying to conspire to take down yachts or whatever. And that compared to Jaws, with this idea that there's this shark that exists to just, screw with people, and and it kind of breaks my mind a little bit, because it's like this thought that these animals are being intentionally cruel, and then we have this science coming out talking about, as you say, more and more talking about sentience and talking about the way that animals perceive the world. And I don't know, like, how do you kind of think about the difference between like choice and curiosity within animals, and how should we be thinking about the behaviors that we're seeing?
Yeah. So, I really like that parallel between, or that example of the shark in Jaws, and then the way that we're perceiving those orcas. And I think so that really also brings in the social construction of animals, which is like another whole piece of this, right? And that's something I think, so for me as a silence journalist, it's been really, really revelatory to understand that, so much of what we think about animals, really comes out of this interaction between what we actually know about animals and then the social narratives that exist around them. And it gets real messy real fast, right? And so, and with so of course Jaws, right? Like I don't. So I'll confess, I only dimly remember Jaws, and I did not watch the sequels. And if I
Don't watch the
remember,
sequels. That's nobody should watch the sequels.
if I remember correctly, in one of the sequels, like the protagonist of the first movie had moved to Florida or something, and like the shark like followed him down there to take vengeance, which is awesome. But like that aside, the portrayal of the shark in Jaws is kind of this, almost just this like killing machine, versus what is a relatively more nuanced understanding of what's going on with the orcas, is striking. And like the orca coverage has been all over the place too, right? Like there's the, kind of that initial idea that they were attacking the yachts. And I think the science has settled more now on it. It's about that, it's a form of play. Um, and but also like the difference between what you will see in, like a really scientifically informed story written by somebody who, written by a reporter who talks to people who study whales, is so different than like what you see in like the tabloid and quick click press. And where, it's just so much sloppier. And and so I think it was interesting the way that like the idea that they were attacking is something that, we just like very quickly went to that. And I think it says something about us that, we perceived what they were doing in terms of an attack in the first place. And of course that was helped by the fact that they're attacking the boats of rich people, which, is something that like 99% of us support wholeheartedly. But 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 I'd say there's been at least like a more of a sense that those orcas, are not just kind of like rigidly following some instinctively prescribed path, which is also one of like violence. There's not so much a sense of that. Like people are more open to the possibility that, yeah, they might be playing, or maybe it's a maladaptive cultural response where like, these are just orcas who have not had good role models. I mean, there's more nuances, at least nowadays.
I want to ask about some of these, that your coverage of sort of the legal status of animals, but before we go to that, I actually want to stay on this topic of the word I can't pronounce, anthropomorphizing.
Say it
I
5 times fast.
I know something that always gets like stuck like in between my brain and my mouth when I try to say that word. But anyway, there was an article recently in the Atlantic, I don't know if you saw that, about how researchers like think about their own anthropomorphism of animals, and whether like, I think it was like, this idea of, first it being like, oh, we don't want to do this. And then kind of like, well, maybe we like embracing it. Like we do it anyway, so let's do it. And so I guess, I don't know, that's another thing that's kind of like changed, is there's a lot of, not a lot, but there's at least some coverage of like the field kind of taking stock of itself, which is kind of interesting. And, it just, I'm thinking the part of your book where you talk about kind of like the birds building nests and people thinking of it like or scientists dismissing it as kind of like, oh, that's just instinct. And then what is instinct anyway? I guess that kind of like blew my mind, because I was sort of like, yeah, how do researchers, I don't even know what question I'm trying to get at. It's just more like, I'm kind of like struck by how difficult, I guess, it is for like, I can't imagine trying to figure out what the dividing line is between like animals teaching each other and versus just like something that's instinct, because it's not like a simple test you can just check. And so I guess I'm wondering if you have just thoughts on that, of like, I don't know, like any researchers that stand out in terms of kind of like being able to reflect on their own kind of biases, I guess, in a way that's kind of good.
Yeah. So I think so. First of all, I'd like to give a shout out here to a researcher named Gordon Burkhardt, and he's kind of one of the like really one of the pioneers of the study of reptile intelligence. And he's I think he might actually be a professor emeritus at this point. He's an old school type, who really came up in a scientific environment where anthropomorphism was just, it was really, it was an insult that you would hurl at a researcher, not something to think critically about. And so he actually coined the term critical anthropomorphism, where he said, no, anthropomorphism, which for any of your listeners or viewers who don't know what the term is, it just means interpreting the behavior of of another entity, usually another animal, sort of in human terms, in terms of human behavior. And it's generally, historically, it's had a negative connotation, right? Where the idea is that if you're doing this, you're kind of being overly sentimental or not thinking critically about that comparison. And so Gordon Burkhardt coined the phrase critical anthropomorphism, where he said, okay, anthropomorphism, this isn't a bad thing, right? Like we exist on an evolutionary continuum with other species, not just in the composition of our bodies, but in our mental processes. And to kind of deny that deny that human behaviors could be a lens through which to see animal behaviors was just nonsensical and counterproductive. But that being said, you also need to be very careful about it. And maybe an easy way of illustrating that would be, if you take the average mole who doesn't really make use of their sight at all because they're subterranean dwellers who rely mostly on smell and touch. So you're not going to go far in thinking about what a mole experiences if you are thinking of them as seeing. I mean, that's like a really simplistic example, but that's kind of, an obvious way in which the human experience and the mole experience don't line up. But if you think rigorously about it, then it's okay to be anthropomorphic. And this is a tool that we can use to help understand and to help study other creatures. And I think really that's something where, especially with younger scientists coming up these days, anthropomorphism is not a bad word anymore. And people, and researchers really are reflecting upon how best to, use that perspective, how best to harness that perspective and not to be afraid of thinking of, animals doing things in ways that we do, or us doing things in ways that animals do. It's easy to kind of make the formulation still all about us, right? But it goes in both directions. And then just like the research that happens, I've been critical about, the ways in which science has, kind of had its head in the sand about animal intelligence for much of the last several centuries. But I think sort of one, I'm not going to call it a silver lining, but a silver-ish lining, is that in order to make claims about animal intelligence, researchers have really been forced to come up with very strong evidence. And that means strong experimental designs and strong methodological practices. And some of the ways of studying animal intelligence that they've come up with are just so ingenious and clever. And so the two studies that jump to mind when I say that, one is the kind of now famous work on bumblebee emotions, and that the way that researchers have been able to get at the emotional experiences of bumblebees is by harnessing something that's known as cognitive bias tests. So this is a cognitive bias, basically means like in humans, like, is the glass half full or is it half empty? And like if you're in a good mood, if you're happy, that glass is half full. And if you're in a bad mood, you're unhappy, the glass is half empty. And so then with bumblebees, let's say you can sort of train them in a setup where if they press a red button, and I can't remember if they're actually pressing a button, but you know what I mean. Or if they press a red button, then they get a sweet drink. If they press if they press like a blue button, they get a sweet drink. And if they press a yellow button, they get a really sour drink or a bitter drink. And then you present them with a color that's just sort of halfway in between blue and yellow or whatever color it is. And then are they going to press that button and take the chance? And if they're, if you've just like shaken up their hive, or I guess bumblebees don't live in hives, but if you've just, if you've just exposed them to something that is known to be a physical stressor, that you would assume would stress them out, well, then they are going to be more pessimistic. They're in a bad mood. They're less likely to, press that indeterminately colored button than if they've, been eating and the temperature is right, and have been in conditions that one would think would foster positive bumblebee affect. And so those bees, they press that button. They're like, all right, the world's a good place. I feel good. I'm going to take that chance. And so just that, like, just that study design, it's kind of so simple and so brilliant. And then one other study I want to mention, the question of self-awareness is this whole big thing we could talk for like the rest of the hour about. But kind of as a quick synopsis of where things are at these days is just that, once upon a time it was thought that self-awareness was something only humans had, and then we're like, well, maybe it's humans and chimpanzees and Asian elephants and maybe manta rays and a few other species. And now there's much more of a sense that self-awareness is something that exists in a great many forms. It's just not a human style of self-awareness and nothing else. And that you can have sort of these extremely complicated forms of self-awareness, but then there's also very simple, fundamental forms of self-awareness. So basically just knowing that you are you, that the experiences you are having are you, that you're not the same entity as your surroundings. This is sort of what's called pre-reflective self-awareness or a body self-awareness. And one way of getting at this was used in this study that was done with rat snakes. So rat snakes, you like almost this cartoon image of like, like a rat snake before eating just looks like a snake. And then after a rat snake has eaten a rat, they've got a big rat-shaped bulb in their middle. So you present them, they have to go from point A to point B. And in order to get from there, they have to pass through an opening. And so before they've eaten, they will go through a small opening because, of course, that's going to fit their bodies. But after they've eaten and their middle has expanded, then in order to go back in the other direction, in order to get from point A to point B, they'll go through the correct size hole. They won't try to cram their now swollen bodies through the original small hole. They'll use the one that's the right size. And so that is a way of illuminating, that they are aware of their bodies. And that is just like a fundamental part of the self. But so again, just like the most simple way of studying something and yet just brilliantly clever at the same time.
It's obviously you covered so much there, Brandon. It's a lot for us to digest, like the rat snake. So that like I feel like one of my the things that I always hate is when we look at these studies and it's done from such like a human-centric point of view that you feel like you're just missing everything, like trying to think of these animals as perceiving the world the way that we do. So it's really super interesting to hear about this new approach where this critical I can't say it now, this critical anthropomorphization, whatever, of these animals and of the work is in place. And I think like what stands out to me throughout everything that you're saying there is like, what if we know all of these things, at Sentient, we do a lot of tracking on trends. So we're constantly seeing that more and more people, as you say, over the last 5 years, we've tracked this transition too, where more and more people are actually Googling and searching for information about animal sentience do lobsters feel pain? Like, the cows like being milked? Like, are animals sentient? What animals are intelligent, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing this increase like year on year in terms of what people are looking for. And it kind of makes me feel, with this, everything that you've just laid out there, with this idea that people are thinking more about these topics and about, pain and sentience and intelligence and, personhood. Like, what is our responsibility? Like, how should we act on that? Like, what should the takeaway be? And especially when we're thinking, as you bring out in your book, and as you mentioned at the beginning, this, like, we have the wild animal approach, but then, obviously we know that a vast majority of the animals on this planet are farmed animals. So how do we square that? How do we think about, like, what is our responsibility, I guess, to the wild and the farmed animals as a result of knowing all of this information?
Yeah, I mean, that is the essential question that comes out of this. And I would argue it's, the essential question at the heart of the fate of the rest of non-human life on Earth, right? And so the way that I think about this, let me try to put a couple threads out there and then see if I can weave them together. So one of those threads is that I think the more we understand about the minds of other animals, the more we appreciate how arbitrary the lines that we draw between them. And I mean, not just the scientific lines, but the ethical lines, where, there are some animals who are farmed animals. And so for the most part, they're just invisible to us and we don't think about them. And then there's animals who are used in research, and of course our companion animals, who are the animals who get to be, full persons for the most part. And then there's wild animals who kind of, also occupy what's almost an in-between space, where sometimes they're invisible and sometimes they get to be individuals. And it really depends a lot on context. And so one of the things that I hope Meet the Neighbors does is really provide a framework for understanding kind of how those lines came to be drawn in the first place, and kind of what is this, like, intellectual infrastructure we inherit in how we think about animals. And then I argue that, at least, when it comes to animals used for food and in research and our companions and what have you, the conversations around them are happening, right? Like, the change isn't happening in the world as quickly as many of us would like to see, but at least this is something that's on people's minds and people are thinking it through. But when it comes to nature, and this is really, like an animating principle of Meet the Neighbors, but when it comes to nature, that sense of seeing wild animals as fellow persons, is just really something that has been pushed to the margins of popular culture for more than a century, and never entirely extinguished, but kind of not considered serious knowledge, and not really incorporated within, the frameworks or the lenses that usually mediate the way that we see nature and think about wild nature. So whether it's, conservation biology, or sort of, the idea of nature as beautiful, or ecosystem services, or transcendence, or, just sort of all of these lenses that we have, like, animals as fellow thinking, feeling beings with meaningful communities and relationships of their own, just kind of really don't appear, right? And so that's what I'm trying to get at with Meet the Neighbors, is the wild nature part of that. And then when it comes to, sort of, okay, so what are our ethical duties and our obligations, and just, like, the way we should be living with our kin? It's like, I'm always very happy to talk about where my own thinking has taken me and what my own answers are. But I also, I don't want to, I think the very first thing we owe other animals is to take them into account this way, and to sort of make this understanding of them as fellow persons part of the moral equation, whatever the moral equation is for us, whatever those calculations take you. We should at least be clear and about who they are. And once that's taken into account, like, I don't want to tell other people where I think they should end up, although I certainly have ideas about where I've ended up. But I do want to give people sort of tools for thinking about it, and then tell stories of people who have taken these insights, out onto the landscape and into the world. And, and often the people doing that, just like the rest of us, they might not be fully consistent. Like this isn't, a book about, nine stories of vegans in nature, but it is, just a book about people who are wrestling with what does it mean to think about other animals as persons, and what does it mean to think of them as kin, and just trying to go forward with that.
Have you found, I think about this a lot, like in, having some of these conversations, like what are ways that make it a conversation essentially about how to look at animals versus just, a monologue or shutting down, or what kind of like makes people resist versus like what unlocks curiosity. And I guess, yeah, like either like in the course of interviewing so many people or just talking to people about the book, are there sort of like kind of bigger like aspects that you, or things that seem to do that more successfully, than other, I mean, obviously we can think of things that would not be successful, but like, were there things was like, oh, this was surprising, like I had a conversation this way and I thought the person was going to be kind of resistant. And I don't mean, about like veganism, but just like, thinking about animals and talking about them, in an engaging kind of way.
Well, I think one thing that's really, I think, really helpful and reassuring is that really like everybody loves animals, right? We're usually pretty inconsistent about it, but like at some level everybody connects to animals. And certainly like when we're children, like pretty almost all children just have that like instinctive feeling of connection. And it can get overgrown with time, and it's really hard to keep that alive, but like it's there. And I think often, it's not difficult for it to come to the surface. And, and I think sort of just engage. I don't want to sound trite, but like engage with what we have in common, right? Like, and don't, and so there's sort of the obvious no-nos, which is like, don't be self-righteous. Don't come into a conversation like telling people what you think they should do. And I should say also, like, I'm not always the greatest practitioner of this. Like I write about a lot of people who are much better at this in their day-to-day lives than I am. But
you just have to say like day to day, this is me also. Like I'll have this one like great conversation. I mean, about anything, not just oh, I'm doing so great this, and then next day just be like, you are wrong,
Totally. But
I don't tend to have the good days. I'm just like the you are wrong person. So I try to leave the talking to other people.
I know, right? Like, but one anecdote I wanted to share that I loved. So there are some foxes in my neighborhood who I quite like, and sometimes this is difficult, right? Because I really love the groundhogs too. I feel an special kinship for the groundhogs, and I've seen the foxes eat a lot of groundhogs, and that can be something that can be difficult to make peace with. But that being said, I really, really appreciate the foxes as well. And so a few years ago, when there were fox cubs somewhere nearby, and the parents were just hunting all the time, and like fox parents work so hard to care for their children, I would pick up squirrels who had been run over on a road somewhere, and just leave them down in a corner of the driveway for the foxes to find, to try to make things a little bit easier for them. And so anyways, like I was here in Bangor, Maine, where I lived. I had just pulled over by the side of the road and, gone out to pick up a squirrel who'd been flattened in the middle. And this guy came out of his house, and he had like, he just shouted at me. He's like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And it wasn't like, "What are you doing?" It was like, "No, what are you doing?" And he had the whole phenotype, right? Like he was, just this like, like big, burly, hard-looking dude who I just thought was going to be, giving me some, either giving me the get out of my neighborhood treatment, or else just like, "What are you doing, you weirdo, picking up this animal? This is," but I told him what I was doing, and he said, and the next thing he said, he was just like, he was like, I see squirrels get run over here all the time, and it breaks my heart to see their bodies just out there in the road like that. And so what he does is he'll just go out and gather the body and bury them in his garden behind his house. And it was just like every assumption I had about where the interaction was going to go, it was the opposite of that. Um and I think about that a lot, right? Like, and just, not leaping to conclusions about what other people think, and being open to just how we all feel such a connection with the animals, and we do the best we can, and sometimes we just need permission to be open about it.
That's so true. That's a really beautiful story. I mean, I guess we're kind of sadly running out of time. I feel like we could keep talking about all of these things for hours and hours. I had one question which I'm curious about. In the course of writing this book, because I feel like you're so experienced and you've done, you spent so long in this space, but in the process of writing Meet the Neighbors, was there anything about animal behavior or sentience or whatever like that surprised you? Was there any kind of like, I never knew that, this animal could do this, or anything like that stood out?
I mean, so there's so many of those moments. But I think maybe I'm gonna say maybe what I came to appreciate most that I didn't fully appreciate before was just how much companionship means to so many animals. And maybe that should be obvious, right? Maybe I should have thought of that in the first place. But I think, I didn't, things like friendship, thinking of other animals as having, friends and social ties and kind of community norms that are meaningful. I hadn't fully thought through the social dimension, or fully learned about the social dimension of things and thought through what that meant, maybe as much as I had, these sorts of other, questions of self-awareness, or whether an animal feels pain or not, or thinks about the future, and so on. And just like one beautiful kind of vein of research that I hope to write about much more in the future is scientists who have found ways of very unobtrusively and non-invasively tracking the movements of flocks of birds as they migrate. And there's this one study that was done with I think they're named honey eaters, or bee eaters. Anyways, these birds are flying like many thousands of miles, and they're going the whole way with the same companions, right? Or if they get separated along the way, then they're managing to reunite at the end. And just like, like migration is the most incredible thing, right? Like to be this small, delicate creature who finds their way across half the globe, orienting by geomagnetic lines and the stars, and eating what they can along the way. I mean, it is the most incredible journey. And then to think about that journey is also one in which, they're making it with their family, with their people. And that just makes it so much more resonant to me.
That's so. I just a quick follow up here. I came across my desk this morning an article in the Financial Times that was from January this year about using AI to track animal intelligence and using it to decode, conversations and monitor them in this kind of unintrusive way, as you're talking about. Have you looked at like progression in AI for this kind of thing before, or what are your thoughts on that?
A little bit. I'll say that like there's just kind of this like whole world of like AI hype. And I think sometimes that also gets extended to, using AI to look at what animals do, not so much in the sense that AI techniques can't offer something new, but like the work that scientists have done on animal communication in the last few decades is extraordinary. And we've learned so much. And like the idea that AI can help illuminate more shouldn't come at the expense of appreciating just how much we do understand now. But so that being said, I think AI tools can be really useful. and not just in analyzing animal vocalizations, which is how they're usually portrayed. And I think this is a function, of being sort of anthropomorphic in a negative way, where, we put so much importance on language, and so much of our own communication takes the form of language. And and so naturally, when we think of understanding what other animals communicate, we're like, oh, well, what are they saying? But for many species, scent is such an important form of communication, and then body language and gesture are incredibly important. And there are researchers who are looking at those other modalities through the lens of AI as well, and especially a primatologist named Catherine Hobader, who studies chimpanzee gestures. And I saw a presentation recently where, she's been taking some of these tools and using them to analyze the gestures they make. And oh, it's just remarkable.
Like debating because I have so many different questions in my head right now, and now we're running out of time. But I guess no, I think well, okay. I did want to at least ask you about kind of like your thoughts on how journalists cover animals generally, because I guess for me it was like, I'm sort of in this food ag world, and I also, when I started at Sentient, was very committed to sort of kind of stripping out emotional language, I guess, from our writing. I was like, I want us to sound like everyone else, essentially. Like I really had that as like, kind of a strong feeling in my head. And then, or whatever, wherever my feelings come from. And then like, when I started sort of reading more journalism about wild animals, and I was like, this is so strange because it's like almost the exact opposite of what I'm talking about. But if we were to write about farm animals that way, it would be like, this is weird vegan shit, like, and so I think I do a nice job in the book of kind of just like, just talking about all of the animals. And I wonder if you think we'll see more of that, or if you felt like a little self-conscious doing, like, where do you think kind of the state of how we write about farm animals, I guess, is, or how you maybe think about that yourself? Big question.
Yeah, that is a really big question. So I think it's, so I very much commiserate with the dilemma that you faced in wanting to, write quote unquote emotionally, or about animals, and feeling like, you had to sound like everybody else, because we do live in an ecosystem where, like, if I think global warming is terrible and really, really hope that humanity finds a way to not overheat the earth, like, that's okay, right? Like, I can still write about climate change. Nobody is gonna, no editor, no reader is going to call that, a meaningful conflict of interest. But if I wear the fact that I don't think we should eat animals on my sleeve, or at least not animals who live a life that I would have been happy to live, then, well, that is a conflict of interest. That's kind of weird. You're self-conscious about it, and then at the same time, it's completely customary. Like, if you're a food writer and you're like, here's my article about the best hot dogs in America, nobody calls that a conflict of interest, that you don't think of those hot dogs as coming from an animal who is a someone. So there's this double standard that makes writing about farmed animals very difficult. And, of course, if you're only writing for the people who are already in your circle, then it's no trouble at all. But if you hope to reach outside of that, then you have to wrestle with that. And I think, or at least I'm hopeful that the needle is moving, and that it is becoming more permissible to feature, to include the voices of people, to include the voices of animal advocates in stories. And this is certainly by no means universal yet. And it is still like unendingly frustrating to me that publications will have articles about the intelligence of animals and articles specifically about the intelligence of farmed animals. And yet if a story is about farmed animal trade policy or just food and recipes, then the perspectives heard when talking about animal intelligence are not included in the perspectives heard in those stories about trade policy or cooking recipes. And I think that's an inconsistency. It doesn't really hold water intellectually. And I'm hopeful that over time it'll be, over time the reporting will be better. And but yeah, that's an uphill battle, especially with farmed animals. I think it's a bit easier with wild animals at least.
Is this something that you feel you'll be working on next? Like thinking about your next steps post this book? Like what are your plans?
Oh, I mean, so there's endless stories I have about animal intelligence that I hope I'll find people who will pay me to write them. And then also some other stories that are just about nature and things that are not about animal intelligence that I'd like to get into. But I do think a lot about how much I would enjoy, a deep dive into sort of what like so this is, I know this so this is going to be something I think that maybe that your vegan listeners and viewers will understandably not maybe be a fan of, but like are is it at all possible to have relationships with the animals that are consumptive, but also genuinely, truly respect them and give them lives that you and I would want to lead? I think, just in as much as I would love for the whole world to go vegan tomorrow, as much as that is not going to happen, I think this question of what are truly acceptable relationships with animals who are used is a powerful one. And I love the sanctuary movement, and I volunteer every week at my nearby sanctuary. And I think, the moral imperative to support those is enormous, especially for people who, like me, like in the first 40 years of my life, I ate so many animals, and the least I can do to give back a little to them is to take care of some farmed animals. But that being said, I think there's a limit on how far sanctuaries can go, and there is that kind of internal tension where sanctuaries are possible because people are able to donate to support them and pay the salaries of the staff who work so hard to care for those animals. And they can, in a sense, they're not quote unquote scalable. So I think sanctuaries give this wonderful, beautiful window into relationships with farmed animals that don't otherwise exist, and are so kinder and more just beyond. But then sort of the question of yeah, like sort of what relationships, what other relationships are possible that, have those elements of respecting for the animals and caring for the animals, and allowing them to live full lives in intact social groups, for their own benefit and not for our own profit. Is it possible to take all that and still say, okay, and we will use their fur and eat their flesh. And maybe it's not, right? Like maybe those two visions are just completely opposed, and they can't be reconciled. But I would like to explore that space.
Yeah, and investigate those communities where they believe they are having those relationships, and what the end of life for the animals looks like, and all of these aspects within it. That sounds super interesting. And yeah, I look forward to following up with you over time with that, your investigations. Brandon, where can people get your book?
At your favorite local bookseller, or of course Amazon or Barnes and Noble or all the other big booksellers as well. And thank you so much for bringing me on here to talk about it. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed talking to you.
We've really enjoyed it, and I'm so grateful for the work that you do, and I fully recommend this book and your first book to anybody who's interested in anything that you've said in this conversation and more. And Jenny, I'm sure you you feel the same.
Yes, thanks so much for doing this. It was a great conversation.
Yes, thank you.
Likewise.